The courtroom was already half full when Donald Walker leaned back in his chair and whispered something to his lawyer that made them both chuckle. I remember noticing how relaxed he looked that morning, suit pressed, shoulders loose, like a man who already believed the day was going his way. Across the aisle, his wife Mirabel sat quietly with her hands folded in her lap. She hadn't said a word since the hearing started. Then she finally spoke, and the question she asked Donald made the entire room go still. "Donald, are you absolutely sure that baby she's carrying is yours? Welcome to Mr. Graham's story, my beautiful, amazing family. Y'all have been so supportive, and I promise to always do my best to give you the best as I learn and improve every day." If this is your first time watching, comment below with where you're watching from, and subscribe to officially join the family. Most mornings in Mirabel Johnson's house started before the sun had fully made up its mind to rise. It usually began with footsteps, small ones. "Mama, the sun awake yet?" Mirabel opened one eye and saw her 4-year-old son standing beside the bed, hair sticking up in every direction, clutching the stuffed dinosaur he refused to sleep without. She glanced at the clock on the nightstand, 6:02 a.m. "Not really," she murmured, voice still thick with sleep. "But I guess you are." He grinned like that was the only answer that mattered. From down the hallway came the unmistakable sound of a toddler protesting the injustice of the morning. "Mama." That would be her 2-year-old daughter. Mirabel swung her legs over the side of the bed and rubbed her face. "All right," she sighed softly. "Everybody up." The house in Jacksonville wasn't big, but it was warm in the way homes become when children fill every corner with noise and evidence of their existence. Toy cars under the couch, crayons rolling across the kitchen counter, a tiny pink shoe that somehow ended up in places no one remembered putting it. By 6:20, the kitchen lights were on, and Mirabel was moving through her usual rhythm. Eggs sizzling in the skillet, a small cup of apple juice, a plate that would probably end up half-eaten, because toddlers change their minds about breakfast every 6 minutes. Her son sat at the table swinging his legs. "Mama," he asked seriously, "why the sun follow us when we drive?" Mirabel slid the eggs onto his plate. "The sun ain't following us, baby." He frowned like he wasn't convinced. "Then why it keeps showing up?" Before she could answer, her daughter waddled into the kitchen wearing one sock and holding the other like a trophy. "Mama!" Mirabel crouched down. "Well, look at you," she said, smiling. Motherhood had changed the way she moved through the world. Before the kids, mornings had been quiet. Coffee, news headlines, a little silence before work. Now they were loud, messy, unpredictable, and somehow better. She tied her daughter's shoes, while her son tried to convince her dinosaurs could probably beat sharks in a fight. Outside, Jacksonville was slowly waking up. Cars moving down the street. Humidity already hanging in the air like Florida's quiet reminder that summer never really leaves. Mirabel loaded the kids into the car with the patience she had practiced for years. Her son asked 3 more questions before they even reached the end of the street. Her daughter dropped a cracker and screamed like the world had ended, but Mirabel never raised her voice. That was something people noticed about her. Calm, even when life got loud, even when things got hard. She had learned that kind of steadiness long before she became a mother. It started on Jacksonville's north side, in a neighborhood where everybody knew everybody, and news traveled faster than the evening breeze. Her grandmother's house sat on a corner lot with a porch that had seen 3 generations grow up. The paint had chipped years ago, but nobody cared, because inside that house lived something more valuable than appearances: family. Sundays were never quiet there. By noon, the kitchen smelled like cornbread and collard greens. Uncles argued about football. Cousins ran through the house like tiny hurricanes. Someone's auntie was always laughing too loud at a story everybody had already heard 10 times. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Mirabel would sit at the table listening, watching how adults solved problems, watching how they argued, but still passed the sweet tea. Her grandmother had a saying she repeated whenever life got rough. "Life don't reward perfect people," she'd say while stirring a pot on the stove. "It rewards the ones who keep standing." Mirabel never forgot that, because she watched her grandmother live it. Bills that didn't always get paid on time, family members who needed help, long days that turned into longer nights. But that woman never folded. She stood, and somehow the family stood with her. That lesson stayed with Mirabel long after she grew up and moved into her own life. At 32, she carried that same quiet strength. People at work respected her for it. She managed a medical billing office downtown, a job that required patience most people didn't have. Doctors rushing, insurance companies arguing over numbers, phones ringing nonstop. But Mirabel handled it the same way she handled everything else, steady. Her coworker Carla once shook her head during a particularly chaotic afternoon. "I don't know how you stay this calm," Carla said. Mirabel shrugged while reviewing a patient file. "You just deal with what's in front of you." "But girl," Carla laughed, "most people lose their mind doing that." Mirabel smiled. "Then I guess I ain't most people." It wasn't arrogance. It was simply how she had learned to move through life. Handle what needs handling. Show up for the people who depend on you. Keep standing. That belief shaped the way she approached everything. Work, family, love. Because once upon a time, Mirabel believed she had found someone who shared that same kind of steadiness. Someone she believed she could build a life with. His name was Donald Walker. But the truth about how their story began, and how it eventually unraveled, was far more complicated than anyone looking from the outside could have guessed. The night Mirabel met Donald Walker almost didn't happen. It had been a long Tuesday at the medical billing office, the kind of day where every insurance company suddenly decided they needed different paperwork and every doctor wanted answers immediately. By the time 5 o'clock rolled around, Mirabel's head was pounding. She was already halfway out the office door when her coworker Carla called after her. "Hold up, where you think you going?" Mirabel paused and turned around slowly. "Home," she said, like the answer should have been obvious. "Where normal, tired people go." Carla grabbed her purse and walked over. "You forgot what tonight is." Mirabel blinked. "Yes." Carla sighed dramatically. "The hospital charity fundraiser? The one I told you about 3 times? Oh, that." Mirabel rubbed her temple. "Carla, I am not in the mood to stand around a room full of strangers pretending to care about tiny appetizers." Carla crossed her arms. "Girl, you've been working, raising kids, and going straight home for the last 4 years. That's called responsibility. That's called forgetting you're still allowed to live a little." Mirabel tried not to smile, but Carla had always been persistent. "Come on," Carla continued. "1 hour. If it's boring, we leave." Mirabel hesitated. Part of her wanted to say no, but another part of her knew Carla had a point. Life had become very predictable. Work, kids, home, repeat. "Fine," she sighed. 1 hour. Carla grinned. "See? I knew you weren't completely hopeless." 2 hours later, Mirabel stood inside a downtown Jacksonville hotel ballroom, wondering how she had been talked into this. Soft music played near the stage. People in suits and cocktail dresses moved around the room, balancing wine glasses in polite conversations. The fundraiser supported community healthcare programs, which was why the hospital had encouraged staff to attend. Carla was already deep in conversation with a group of people near the bar. Mirabel, meanwhile, drifted toward the dessert table, not because she was hungry, because it gave her something to do with her hands. She picked up a small plate and studied the options like they required serious thought. Mini cheesecakes, chocolate truffles, some kind of strawberry pastry that looked too pretty to eat. You look like you're calculating the exact moment it becomes socially acceptable to leave. The voice came from beside her. Mirabel turned. The man standing there was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a navy suit that looked expensive but not flashy. He held a plate too, though he didn't seem particularly interested in the desserts. His expression carried the relaxed confidence of someone who felt comfortable in rooms like this. Mirabel studied him for a second. "You caught me," she admitted. He smiled. "I knew it." She raised an eyebrow. "What gave it away?" "You're standing near the exit," he said casually, nodding toward the ballroom doors behind them. "That's usually the first clue." Mirabel laughed. "Wow, you must do this kind of observation professionally." "Construction, actually." He extended his hand. "Donald Walker, Mirabel Johnson." Their handshake was firm but easy. Donald glanced at the dessert table again. "You at least gonna pretend to try something?" Mirabel picked up a tiny cheesecake. "If I'm going to survive this event, I might as well get dessert out of it." Donald chuckled. They moved toward a quieter corner of the room. At first, their conversation was simple. where they worked, how they ended up at the event. Donald explained that his construction company had helped renovate a local clinic that partnered with the hospital. It started as a small project, he said. Now they keep calling us for new work. That's a good problem to have, Mirabel replied. He nodded. What about you? I manage the billing office. Donald winced playfully. So you're the person who sends those confusing insurance statements? Hey, Mirabel laughed. I don't make the rules. I just survive them. The conversation flowed easily after that. They talked about growing up in Jacksonville. Donald described the quiet suburb where he was raised. Perfect lawns, he said. Neighbors who wave but never actually come inside your house. Mirabel shook her head. That sounds strange to me. Why? Where I grew up, if somebody smelled food cooking in your house, they might just walk in and grab a plate. Donald laughed. Seriously. She told him about her grandmother's house on the north side. Sunday dinners, cousins everywhere. The loud, messy beauty of a family that never quite fit inside the walls of one house. Donald listened carefully, not just politely, actually listening. You know, he said after a moment, that sounds nice. Mirabel tilted her head. You didn't have that growing up? Not really. Donald shrugged. My parents were good people, hardworking. But everything was quiet. Quiet ain't always peaceful, Mirabel said thoughtfully. Donald looked at her like that sentence carried more meaning than it first appeared. What about you? She asked. Construction company sounds like a lot of responsibility. It is, he admitted. Why'd you start it? Donald leaned back slightly. Honestly? Yeah. He thought for a second. My dad worked for other people his whole life. Always said he wished he had built something of his own. And you wanted to do that? Donald nodded. I guess I didn't want to look back one day and wonder what could have happened if I tried. Mirabel studied him for a moment. Then she asked a question Donald wasn't expecting. Do you work that hard because you love the work? She said calmly. Or because you're afraid to slow down? Donald blinked. For the first time that evening, he didn't immediately have an answer. He looked at her. Then he laughed softly. You ask a lot of deep questions for someone standing next to a cheesecake. Mirabel smiled. Just curious. Donald shook his head, still smiling. Well, Mirabel Johnson, I have a feeling talking to you might make a man think about things he hasn't thought about before. That dangerous? Possibly. Across the room, Carla noticed the conversation and raised her eyebrows dramatically at Mirabel. Mirabel ignored her. For the first time all evening, she wasn't counting the minutes until she could leave. She was actually enjoying herself. Neither of them realized it yet. But that simple conversation near the dessert table was the beginning of a relationship that would change both of their lives. For a while, it would feel like the best thing that ever happened to them. After that night at the fundraiser, Donald didn't wait long to call. Mirabel was in the kitchen the following evening helping her son color dinosaurs on a piece of construction paper when her phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced down. Unknown number. Normally she ignored those. Most of the time it was a robocall about car warranties or credit cards she never asked for. But something made her pick it up. Hello? Hey, Mirabel. She recognized the voice immediately. Donald. A small smile appeared on her face before she could stop it. Hey, I hope I'm not calling too late, he said. You're not. Her son tugged her sleeve. Mama, make the dinosaur purple. 1 second, baby, she whispered, covering the phone. Donald chuckled softly on the other end. Sounds like somebody's keeping you busy. That would be my son, she said. He's very passionate about dinosaurs. Purple ones? Apparently, Donald laughed. They talked for 20 minutes that night, then again, the next night, then again, 2 nights later. What started as casual conversations slowly turned into something deeper. Donald began stopping by after work sometimes. At first he would sit on the couch while Mirabel's son showed him toys or asked endless questions about trucks and buildings. Donald didn't seem bothered by it. If anything, he leaned into it. You know, he told the little boy one evening while helping him stack blocks into a tower, I build buildings like this for my job. The boy's eyes widened. Real ones? Real ones. Mirabel watched from the kitchen, leaning against the counter with her arms folded. There was something gentle about the way Donald interacted with her child, not forced, natural. It surprised her. Over the months that followed, Their relationship grew in the kind of quiet, steady way that felt safe. Donald wasn't the type to rush things. He showed up, consistently. Dinner dates, when Mirabel's mother watched the kids. Late-night conversations on the couch after the house was quiet. Long talks about their childhoods, their fears, their hopes for the future. One evening they sat on Mirabel's small front porch watching the Florida sky turn orange and pink as the sun sank lower. Donald leaned back in the chair beside her. "You ever think about where you want to be 10 years from now?" he asked. Mirabel shrugged slightly. "Somewhere peaceful." "That's it?" "That's a lot," she said softly. Donald looked over at her. "You don't want more than that?" "Peace means a lot of things," she replied. "Like what?" "Kids who feel safe, a home that doesn't feel heavy, people around you who show up when life gets hard." She paused. "My grandmother used to say, if you have peace in your house, you're richer than most people." Donald sat quietly for a moment. "You really believe that?" "I do," he nodded slowly. "Then I guess that's what I want too." 2 years later, Donald Walker stood at the front of a small church in Jacksonville, waiting for Mirabel Johnson to walk down the aisle. Her grandmother sat proudly in the first row. Carla dabbed her eyes with a tissue. Mirabel's son, dressed in a tiny suit that made him look like a miniature businessman, held his grandmother's hand while staring curiously at the crowd. When Mirabel stepped through the church doors, the room seemed to pause for a moment. Donald's chest tightened. She wasn't flashy. Her dress was simple, her hair pulled back neatly, but something about the calm way she walked toward him made everything else in the room fade. When she reached the altar, Donald whispered quietly, so only she could hear, "You look beautiful." Mirabel smiled softly. "You clean up pretty good yourself." The ceremony wasn't extravagant, just family, close friends, people who had watched Mirabel grow up, people who believed in Donald. When the pastor finally said, "You may kiss the bride," the room erupted into applause. Outside, the Florida sun was warm and bright. For a while, life felt exactly like the future they had imagined. 2 years into their marriage, Mirabel gave birth to their son. Donald cried in the hospital room, not the quiet kind of tears people try to hide, real ones. He stood beside the hospital bed, holding the tiny newborn in his arms, shaking his head slowly, like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "I made this," he whispered. Mirabel laughed weakly. "We made him." Donald looked down at the baby again. His voice cracked. "I'm gonna take care of him," he said quietly. Mirabel believed him. 2 years later, their daughter arrived. Their house transformed overnight. Suddenly, the quiet evenings were gone. In their place came toy blocks scattered across the floor, tiny shoes near the front door, cartoons playing on Saturday mornings, while pancakes cooked in the kitchen. Their home felt alive. Friends who visited often said the same thing. "You two got a beautiful family," one neighbor told them during a backyard barbecue. Donald wrapped an arm around Mirabel's shoulder. "Yeah," he said proudly, "we do." From the outside, everything looked perfect. Donald's construction company kept growing. More projects, more contracts, more money. Mirabel continued managing the billing office downtown while balancing life at home. Their days were full, busy, sometimes exhausting, but also meaningful. At night, after the kids were asleep, Mirabel would sometimes find Donald sitting at the kitchen table with paperwork spread out in front of him, business plans, contract estimates, project schedules. "You still working?" she'd ask. Donald would rub his eyes, just trying to stay ahead. She'd pour him a glass of water and place it beside him. "You can't build everything in one night." Donald would smile tiredly. "I know, but even in those early days, there were small signs of something deeper inside him. Donald had always been driven, but sometimes that drive looked less like ambition and more like restlessness, like he was chasing something he couldn't quite explain. Mirabel noticed it occasionally, the way he stayed up too late working, the way success never seemed to make him slow down. If anything, it made him push harder. One night she asked him gently, while they sat together on the couch, "You ever think about taking a break?" Donald looked at her like the idea had never crossed his mind. From what? From chasing the next thing. He shook his head. "You don't build something by slowing down." Mirabel studied him quietly. She didn't argue, because she loved Donald, and she believed in him. but sometimes the very qualities that make a person successful in the world can quietly create distance inside a home, and neither of them realized it yet, but the life they had built, the one that looked so strong from the outside, already had its first small cracks beginning to form. At first, the changes in Donald Walker's life looked like success, the kind of success people celebrate, the kind friends congratulate you for, the kind that makes family members say things like, "See? All that hard work paying off." Donald's construction company had always been steady, but a few years into his marriage with Mirabel, things started moving faster. One contract turned into three turned into 6. Developers began calling his office directly instead of the other way around. New commercial renovations, apartment complexes, a medical building on the south side of Jacksonville. Donald's phone rang constantly. At first, Mirabel was proud of him. She remembered the man she met near the dessert table years earlier, talking about wanting to build something of his own. Now he was doing it. One evening, he walked through the front door, carrying a folder so thick it looked like a phone book. "Mirabel," he called, kicking off his shoes near the door. She was sitting on the living room floor, helping their daughter stack plastic blocks into a crooked tower. "In here," she answered. Donald stepped into the room with a tired but excited smile. "You're not gonna believe this." Mirabel looked up. "What happened?" Donald dropped the folder on the coffee table. "Downtown redevelopment project," he said. 3 buildings. Mirabel blinked. "That's big." "Yeah," Donald laughed, still almost in disbelief himself. "That's very big." Their son ran over and grabbed Donald's leg. "Daddy," Donald scooped him up easily. "What's up, man?" "Look," the boy said proudly, pointing to the block tower his sister had mostly knocked over. Donald nodded seriously. "That's a solid building right there." Mirabel smiled, watching them. Moments like this made the late nights worth it, or at least that's what she believed then. At first, the changes were small. Donald started coming home later, not dramatically late, just later than before. Instead of walking through the door around 6, it became 7, sometimes 8. When Mirabel asked about it, Donald always had a reasonable answer. Had to meet with the architects. Client ran late. Traffic was a mess downtown. All believable, all normal. Running a growing business meant longer days. Mirabel understood that. Her grandmother used to say building anything worthwhile required sacrifice. So Mirabel supported him the way she always had. She packed extra food for him when she knew he'd be working late. She stayed up sometimes just to keep him company while he reviewed paperwork at the kitchen table. "You sure you don't want me to look over those numbers?" she asked one night. Donald shook his head without looking up. "You deal with numbers all day at work. Last thing you need is more of them." She leaned against the counter watching him. "You deal with them too." Donald smiled tiredly. "Yeah, but this is my mess." Still, Mirabel could see the pressure building on him. More projects meant more employees. More employees meant more responsibility. Donald started traveling more often too. Short trips at first. Orlando, Tampa, sometimes overnight stays to meet with developers or inspect job sites. The first time he mentioned traveling for work, Mirabel simply nodded. "That's part of growing," she said. Donald kissed her on the forehead. "I won't be gone long." And most of the time, he wasn't. But the rhythm of their household began shifting. Mirabel handled more things alone. School drop-offs, doctor appointments, grocery runs with 2 children who never seemed to agree on anything. One Saturday afternoon, she was sitting at the kitchen table, sorting through school forms, when her son asked a simple question. "Where Daddy?" Mirabel looked up from the papers. "He's working, baby." The boy frowned. "He always working." The words were innocent, but they stayed with her longer than she expected. Later that night when Donald came home, Mirabel mentioned it while they were brushing their teeth. "He asked about you today." Donald spit into the sink and rinsed his mouth. "What'd you tell him?" "That you were working." Donald shrugged. "Well, that's the truth." Mirabel nodded slowly. "I know." She wasn't accusing him of anything, not yet. But something about the conversation left a quiet weight in the room. Donald noticed it. "You okay?" he asked. "I'm fine." "You sure?" "Yeah." She meant it, mostly, because at that stage, the changes still felt like the normal cost of success. Donald was building something, and she believed that what he was building would eventually benefit their entire family. But there's a strange thing about distance inside a marriage. It rarely arrives all at once. It creeps in slowly, through small adjustments, small absences, small moments where two people who once shared everything start living slightly different versions of the same life. Donald still loved his family. Of that, there was no doubt. But as his world expanded outside their home, something subtle began shifting inside him, and Mirabel, with the quiet awareness she had carried since childhood, started noticing things most people might have ignored. At first, they were just small details, but small details have a way of telling the truth long before anyone is ready to hear it. At first, Mirabel tried to convince herself she was imagining things. Marriage, she believed, went through seasons, some easy, some heavier. Her grandmother used to say, long relationships weren't built on constant happiness. They were built on patience. So Mirabel gave Donald patience. But patience doesn't blind a woman to details. And Mirabel had always been someone who noticed details. It started with something small. One evening, Donald walked through the front door just after 9. The kids were already asleep. Mirabel sat at the kitchen table going through emails from work when she looked up and caught a scent she didn't recognize. Donald leaned down and kissed her on the cheek. "Hey," he said. She smiled. "Hey, yourself." But as he walked past her toward the sink, the smell lingered. Cologne, different from the one he had worn for years. Not stronger, just unfamiliar. Mirabel tilted her head slightly. "New cologne?" Donald glanced back casually. "Oh, yeah." He poured himself a glass of water. "Picked it up at the airport last week." Mirabel nodded. "It smells nice." That was the end of that conversation, at least on the surface. But it was the first small detail that settled in the back of her mind. A few weeks later, another one appeared. Donald had always been relaxed about his phone. He left it on the kitchen counter, on the couch, sometimes even on the nightstand, where the kids occasionally grabbed it to play a game. But one night, while they were watching television, Mirabel noticed something new. Donald's phone buzzed. He picked it up quickly, too quickly. Then he stood. "I'm gonna step outside and take this." Mirabel glanced up. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," he said quickly. "Just business." She nodded. "Okay." Through the living room window, she could see him pacing slowly in the driveway, speaking in a lower voice than usual. That wasn't strange by itself, but when he came back inside 10 minutes later, he placed the phone face down on the counter before sitting back on the couch. Face down. Donald had never done that before. Mirabel didn't mention it, but she noticed. Then came the passwords. One evening, she picked up Donald's phone absent-mindedly while cleaning the kitchen. The screen lit up. Password required. She stared at it for a moment. Donald had never locked his phone before. When he walked into the kitchen a minute later, she held it up. "You change your phone settings?" Donald barely glanced at it. "Oh, yeah." He grabbed the phone casually. "Work emails getting more sensitive." "Ah," Mirabel said softly. She returned to wiping the counter. But something in Donald's voice had sounded rushed, not defensive exactly, just uncomfortable. And Mirabel understood something about discomfort. It usually meant someone was hiding something they weren't ready to explain. Still, she kept her thoughts to herself, because suspicion alone doesn't mean betrayal. But the emotional distance kept growing. Their conversations began changing, not dramatically, just enough to feel different. Donald used to ask about her day. Now he seemed distracted when she talked. One night, she was explaining a problem at work involving insurance claims when she realized Donald hadn't responded in almost a minute. He was scrolling through emails on his phone. "Donald." He looked up. "Did you hear what I said?" "Yeah," he answered quickly. "You said something about billing codes." Mirabel studied him quietly. Then she sighed. "You're not listening." Donald put the phone down. "I am listening." "You're distracted." He rubbed his face. "Mirabel, I've got a lot going on right now." "I know." "Then you understand." She nodded slowly. "I do." But the conversation left a hollow space between them. The moment that unsettled her most happened late one night in their bedroom. The house was quiet. The kids had been asleep for hours. Donald sat on the edge of the bed, replying to messages on his phone. Mirabel was already under the covers, reading. She watched him for a few seconds. Something about the tension in his shoulders felt unfamiliar. Finally, she closed her book. "Donald," he looked up. "Yeah, you feel different lately." The words weren't accusing, they were calm, observational. Donald frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," she admitted. "You're just somewhere else." Donald sighed and leaned back against the headboard. "Mirabel, I'm just stressed." "Work?" "Yeah." She studied his face. "You've been stressed before." Donald rubbed his eyes. "Business is growing. That comes with pressure." "I get that. Then what's the problem?" She hesitated. "There's no problem." But they both knew she hadn't fully answered the question. Donald leaned forward and kissed her forehead. "Everything's fine," he said quietly. Then he turned off the bedside lamp. The room fell into darkness. But Mirabel stayed awake longer than usual that night. Not because she was angry, because she was thinking. There's a kind of silence that grows between two people when something unspoken sits in the middle of the room. Not loud, not dramatic, just present. And Mirabel could feel that silence beginning to settle into their marriage. She didn't know exactly what it meant yet, but deep down, a quiet voice inside her had already started whispering something she wasn't ready to accept. Something in Donald's life had changed, and sooner or later, the truth behind those changes was going to surface. The first time Donald met the woman who would eventually destroy his marriage, it didn't feel like anything important. It was just another Tuesday morning at a construction site downtown. The Florida sun had barely climbed above the buildings, and the air already carried that sticky Jacksonville humidity that made shirts cling to your back before noon. Donald stood near a stack of blueprints spread across the hood of a truck, discussing measurements with two subcontractors. "We need that wall framed before Friday," he said, tapping a section of the plans. "Otherwise, the inspectors are going to slow everything down." One of the men nodded. "We'll handle it." Donald folded the blueprints and glanced around the site. Workers moved through the unfinished building carrying tools and materials. The sound of drills and metal clanging echoed through the structure. Just another day running a project. Then he heard a voice behind him. "So, you're the one in charge of all this?" Donald turned. She stood a few feet away, wearing a fitted blazer, sunglasses resting on top of her head. Confident posture, perfect makeup, despite the early hour. She didn't look like someone who belonged on a dusty construction site. Donald brushed some sawdust off his hands. "That depends," he said. "You here to complain about the noise?" She laughed. "No, I'm here with the development group." Donald nodded. "Ah, then yes, I'm the one in charge." She stepped closer, extending her hand. "Nice to finally meet you." Donald shook it. "Donald Walker." She gave her name, introducing herself as someone working with the investors overseeing the building project. Donald didn't think much of it at the time. He dealt with developers and investors all the time. People came through sites asking questions, reviewing progress, making sure their money was being used correctly. But this interaction felt different, not because of what she said, because of how she said it. There was a certain kind of attention in the way she spoke to him, focused, intent. By the end of the conversation, she had complimented the building twice, but both compliments somehow circled back to him. "You run a tight operation. You seem like someone who knows exactly what he's doing." Donald shrugged it off at first. Flattery wasn't unusual in business. Still, something about it lingered. Later that afternoon, as Donald walked through the site checking measurements, he noticed her again, standing near the edge of the second floor with a tablet in her hand. She smiled when she saw him. "You ever slow down?" Donald chuckled. "Not really. That explains why everyone here seems to move when you speak." Donald leaned against the railing. "You're studying the building pretty closely." She shrugged. "Investors like knowing who they're trusting with their money." Donald nodded. "Fair enough." Then she tilted her head slightly. "But honestly, I was more curious about you." That sentence should have raised alarms in Donald's mind. Instead, it fed something inside him he hadn't noticed growing over the past year. Ego. Success had changed the way people spoke to him. Clients respected him. Employees depended on him. Investors trusted him. But admiration carried a different kind of energy. And admiration was something this woman delivered effortlessly. Over the next few weeks, their interactions became more frequent. Sometimes she stopped by the site during inspections. Sometimes she called to ask questions about construction timelines. At first the conversation stayed professional, mostly, but small shifts began appearing. A compliment about how hard he worked, a joke about how most men in business didn't have his discipline, a casual suggestion that they grab lunch to discuss project updates. Donald told himself it was harmless. Lunch meetings were normal in business. Nothing inappropriate about that. The first lunch lasted 45 minutes. The second stretched to nearly 2 hours. The third time they met, Donald realized something uncomfortable. He was enjoying the attention, not because Mirabel had stopped supporting him. Mirabel had always supported him. But admiration from someone new has a dangerous way of making people forget the difference between appreciation and temptation. One afternoon, she looked across the table at him and said something that stuck in his mind. "You know what I like about you?" Donald raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "You don't seem like the type of man who settles." Donald leaned back in his chair. "What does that mean?" "It means," she said slowly, "you're the kind of man who wants more out of life than the average person." Donald didn't respond right away, because in some ways, that sentence touched a part of him he rarely spoke about, the restless part, the part that believed success meant constantly reaching higher, the part that hated standing still. Their lunches continued, then came the messages, then the calls, and eventually, the line Donald once believed he would never cross began to blur. The first time it happened was after a long evening meeting. Donald told himself it was a mistake, something that got out of hand, something that wouldn't happen again. But secrets have a strange gravity. Once they exist, they tend to pull people deeper. The lies started small. "I've got a late meeting. Client dinner ran longer than expected. Traffic downtown is terrible tonight." Each lie felt easier than the one before. And the more Donald divided his life into separate pieces, the easier it became to pretend those pieces would never collide. But the one person Donald underestimated during all of this was Mirabel. Because Mirabel Johnson had spent her entire life learning how to read the quiet details people try to hide. And eventually, those details began forming a picture she could no longer ignore. The night she discovered the truth didn't involve screaming, or thrown objects, or dramatic accusations. It happened in the quietest way possible. Donald had fallen asleep on the couch after coming home late. His phone rested on the coffee table. For a long time, Mirabel stood in the hallway simply watching him. His breathing slow, his face relaxed, looking exactly like the man she had married. Then his phone buzzed. Once, twice, a message lit up the screen. Mirabel wasn't trying to spy. At least that's what she told herself. But something inside her already knew the truth before her hand even reached the phone. She glanced down. The message preview appeared clearly on the screen. "Miss you already." Her chest tightened. For a moment, she simply stared at the words. Not angry, not shocked, just quiet. Then she looked back at Donald sleeping on the couch. And in that moment, something inside her heart shifted. Not broken, not shattered, just changed. She set the phone back down, exactly where it had been. Then she walked slowly into the kitchen and sat at the table. For nearly an hour, she sat there in silence, thinking, remembering, replaying every small detail from the past year, the late nights, the phone calls, the distance. When Donald finally woke up and walked into the kitchen, he found Mirabel sitting calmly at the table with 2 cups of coffee. He smiled tiredly. "You're still up?" Mirabel nodded. "I was waiting for you." Donald sat down across from her. She slid one of the cups toward him. He took a sip. "Everything okay?" Mirabel looked at him quietly. Then she asked the question that ended the illusion both of them had been living inside. "Donald, do you love her?" The coffee cup froze halfway to his mouth. For the first time in years, Donald Walker had no idea what to say. Donald didn't answer Mirabel's question right away. The kitchen was quiet, except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a car passing outside on the street. "Donald, do you love her?" The words hung between them like something fragile that had already cracked. Donald slowly lowered the coffee cup back onto the table. For the first time in a long time, he looked uncertain. "How did you—" "Your phone," Mirabel said softly. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse him. She simply looked at him with the kind of calm that often appears when someone already knows the truth. Donald leaned back in his chair and rubbed his face. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, He exhaled. I didn't want you to find out like this. Mirabel studied him carefully. There was something strange about hearing him admit it so quickly. No denial, no attempt to lie, just resignation. How long? She asked. Donald hesitated. A few months. The answer landed quietly, but inside Mirabel's chest, something tightened. A few months, she repeated. Donald nodded. Neither of them mentioned the children sleeping down the hallway. Neither of them raised their voices, because sometimes the quietest conversations carry the most damage. Mirabel wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. Is that why you've been coming home late? Donald didn't answer. The silence answered for him. Mirabel stared at the table for a moment. Then she looked back up. Do you love her? Donald shifted uncomfortably. I didn't plan for this to happen. That's not what I asked. His jaw tightened. Another long pause. Finally, he said the one thing Mirabel had hoped not to hear. I care about her. The words didn't sound dramatic. They sounded almost careful, but Mirabel knew what they meant. She leaned back slightly in her chair. Her voice stayed steady. So what happens now? Donald looked at her. For a brief moment, something like guilt crossed his face. I don't know, he admitted. You don't know? I mean, things got complicated. Mirabel almost laughed at that. Complicated. That word always appeared when people tried to soften something ugly. She stood up slowly and walked to the kitchen window. Outside, the street looked exactly the same as it had the night before. Quiet, peaceful, like nothing had changed. Behind her, Donald spoke again. I didn't want to hurt you. Mirabel closed her eyes briefly. You already did. The words weren't sharp. They were simply true. Donald stood up from the table. Mirabel. We can figure this out. She turned around slowly. Can we? Donald opened his mouth, but didn't immediately respond, because deep down, he knew something she already understood. Trust doesn't disappear all at once. It erodes slowly. And once it's gone, rebuilding it takes something most people aren't prepared to give. Accountability. The following weeks felt surreal. Donald moved out first. He told Mirabel it would give them space. In reality, it created distance that made the next step easier. One afternoon, a white envelope appeared in the mailbox. Mirabel opened it standing in the kitchen. Her eyes moved slowly across the legal language. Petition for divorce. For a moment, she simply stood there, holding the papers. Her daughter sat on the floor nearby, stacking toys. Her son ran through the living room, making airplane noises. Life continued moving around her, while something fundamental shifted. Later that evening, Donald came by to see the children. When Mirabel handed him the envelope, his expression tightened slightly. You already saw it. That was fast, she said quietly. Donald rubbed the back of his neck. I thought it would be better to move forward. Forward. The word sounded strange in her mouth. Donald avoided her eyes. Mirabel, this situation isn't healthy for anyone. Mirabel nodded slowly. You're probably right. Donald looked relieved, but the conversation wasn't finished, because Mirabel flipped to the final page of the documents. Then she looked at him again. You filed for full custody. Donald froze. The room suddenly felt smaller. It's just something my lawyer suggested, he said quickly. Suggested? Mirabel, I can provide stability. The words came out too fast, like he had rehearsed them. I've got the business. The house. You have a house, Mirabel replied quietly. We have children. Donald's voice hardened slightly. They deserve the best environment possible. Mirabel stared at him. For the first time since discovering the affair, something close to anger appeared in her eyes. You think I can't give them that? That's not what I said, but it's what you meant. Donald sighed heavily. This isn't personal. Mirabel almost laughed again. Divorce, custody battles, children caught in the middle, and he was calling it not personal. She folded the papers slowly. You know what's interesting? She said calmly. Donald frowned. What? I could understand you leaving the marriage. He looked surprised. But trying to take my children? She continued softly. That part tells me you really don't know me at all. Donald shifted uncomfortably. It's just legal strategy. Mirabel looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. All right. Donald blinked. That's it? That's it. But what Donald didn't realize in that moment was something Mirabel had learned long ago, growing up on Jacksonville's north side. You don't win battles by shouting. You win them by staying calm long enough to think clearly. After Donald left that evening, Mirabel called her mother. "Hey, baby." Her mother answered. "Mama," Mirabel said quietly, "I need a lawyer." Her mother didn't ask many questions. "All right," she said, "we'll find you one." The next morning, Mirabel sat inside a small law office downtown. Across the desk sat a middle-aged attorney reviewing the documents Donald had filed. The lawyer adjusted her glasses. "So your husband believes he should have primary custody?" "Yes." "And you disagree?" Mirabel nodded. The attorney closed the folder slowly. "Well," she said, leaning back in her chair, "then we're going to need to prepare." Mirabel folded her hands in her lap. "Prepare for what?" The lawyer gave a small smile. "For a fight." Mirabel nodded once. Not because she wanted a fight, but because she understood something Donald had clearly forgotten. Mirabel Johnson had spent her entire life standing up when things got hard. And this time, she wasn't standing up for herself. She was standing up for her children. At first, Donald treated the divorce like another business problem. Something complicated, sure, but manageable. He had dealt with lawsuits before. Contract disputes. Developers trying to change terms halfway through projects. In Donald's mind, this was simply another situation that required the right strategy and the right people. His lawyer seemed to reinforce that belief. The man sat across from him in a sleek downtown office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Jacksonville's skyline. "Custody cases are largely about stability," the lawyer explained while flipping through paperwork. Donald leaned back in his chair confidently. "Well, stability is something I've got plenty of." The lawyer nodded. "You own a successful business. You have a strong financial position." Donald folded his arms. "Exactly. Meanwhile," the lawyer continued, "your wife works long hours." Donald shrugged. "She manages a billing office. It's not exactly flexible." The lawyer tapped a pen against the desk. "That could work in your favor." Donald nodded slowly. For the first time since the divorce began, he felt certain the outcome would lean toward him. Money, structure, legal strategy, those were things he understood. Emotion wasn't, and somewhere along the way, Donald had begun seeing the entire situation through that lens. Even when it came to his children. "Courts like fathers who are involved," the lawyer continued. "And you are." Donald didn't hesitate. "Of course I am." "Then, we make that clear." Donald stood up, feeling strangely energized. "Good," he said. "Let's do it." But while Donald focused on winning the legal battle, something else was happening in his personal life. The woman he had left his marriage for was slowly moving deeper into his world. At first, their relationship had existed mostly in private spaces, lunches, late-night meetings, hotel rooms. But now that Donald had moved out of the house he shared with Mirabel, the dynamic shifted. She began spending more time at his place, cooking dinner in his kitchen, leaving small personal items around the apartment. Donald noticed it, but he didn't question it. Part of him actually liked the idea. It felt like proof that he had made the right decision, that his life was moving forward. One evening they sat together on the couch watching television when she muted the screen suddenly. "Donald," he glanced at her. "What?" She looked nervous, which was unusual. She had always been confident, almost fearless in the way she carried herself. "What's wrong?" he asked. She took a breath. "I need to tell you something." Donald sat up slightly. "You're starting to worry me." She placed her hand gently on her stomach. Donald's eyes followed the movement. Then she said it. "I'm pregnant." For a moment, Donald didn't react. The sentence hung in the air like something heavy. "You're what?" "Pregnant." Donald stood up slowly. His mind raced through the timeline. The late nights, the secret meetings, the weeks that had blurred together. "You're sure?" he asked. She nodded. "I took 2 tests. Donald ran a hand through his hair. "Wow." He walked toward the window, staring out at the city lights. This wasn't something he had expected. Not yet. But the more he thought about it, the more the shock began transforming into something else. Possibility, a fresh start. Behind him, she spoke again. "I know this is a lot." Donald turned back toward her. "Yeah," he admitted. "But maybe it's not a bad thing." Her expression softened. "You mean that?" Donald nodded slowly. His voice carried a quiet confidence. Maybe this is exactly what's supposed to happen. The woman smiled with visible relief. She stood up and walked over, wrapping her arms around him. Donald hugged her back. In that moment, his mind began reorganizing the future. A new child, a new household, a new chapter. The divorce suddenly felt less like a loss and more like a transition. Later that week, he mentioned the pregnancy to his lawyer. The lawyer raised an eyebrow. That complicates things. Donald frowned. How? Judges pay attention to stability in a household. Donald waved a dismissive hand. It's not unstable. Your new partner being pregnant during a custody dispute could raise questions. Donald leaned back confidently. I can handle questions. The lawyer studied him for a moment. Donald, family court isn't always predictable. Donald smiled slightly. I build skyscrapers and manage multi-million-dollar projects. He tapped the desk lightly. I think I can handle a courtroom. The lawyer didn't argue, but the silence that followed carried a subtle warning Donald chose not to hear, because, in Donald's mind, everything still pointed in one direction: success. His business was growing. His new relationship was progressing. A baby was on the way. And the custody case, that felt like just another hurdle he would eventually clear. What Donald couldn't see yet was how fragile the foundation of that confidence really was, because the truth about the pregnancy, the truth about the woman he had trusted, and the truth about the evidence Mirabel was quietly collecting would soon collide in a way Donald never saw coming. While Donald convinced himself everything was falling into place, Mirabel's life moved in a very different direction. Not louder, not dramatic, just focused. The morning after meeting with her attorney, Mirabel returned to her normal routine. Her son still asked questions before the sun finished rising. Mama, why birds don't fall when they sleep? Her daughter still refused to wear the same pair of shoes 2 days in a row. The house still smelled like scrambled eggs and toast most mornings. From the outside, nothing about Mirabel's life looked like someone preparing for a custody battle. But beneath the calm surface, she had shifted into a different kind of mindset, the kind her grandmother used to call handling business. Her attorney had explained the situation clearly during their second meeting. The woman leaned forward across the desk and folded her hands. Family court isn't just about who makes more money, she said. Mirabel nodded quietly. Good. The lawyer slid a notepad across the desk. Because we're going to need to document everything. Everything. Yes. She began listing things one by one: work schedules, school pickup records, medical appointments, childcare arrangements, daily routines. Judges want to see who is actually raising the children, the attorney explained, not just who claims they can. Mirabel wrote carefully as the lawyer spoke. What about Donald's travel? She asked. That matters, the lawyer replied. If he's frequently away for work, it affects the stability argument. Mirabel nodded slowly. Then she asked something else. Do I need to prove he cheated? The attorney paused. Infidelity isn't always central in custody cases, she said. But if it shows poor judgment or unstable living situations, it can matter. Mirabel thought about that. Then she closed the notebook. All right. From that day forward, Mirabel began paying closer attention to details. Not out of revenge, out of responsibility. She kept a small planner on the kitchen counter. Every school pickup time, every doctor appointment, every time Donald canceled a scheduled visit with the children because of work, she wrote it down. Quietly, methodically. Donald didn't notice, because most of the time, Donald was busy building the life he believed was waiting for him on the other side of the divorce. Meanwhile, Mirabel stayed rooted in the life she already had. Her attorney checked in with her regularly. During one meeting, the lawyer flipped through the notes Mirabel had been collecting. This is very organized, she said. Mirabel shrugged slightly. I manage billing for a living. The lawyer smiled. That explains it. But what impressed the attorney most wasn't the organization. It was Mirabel's composure. You're not angry, the lawyer observed one afternoon. Mirabel thought about that question carefully. Oh, I was angry, she admitted, when I first found out. But not anymore. Mirabel shook her head slowly. Anger doesn't help my children. The attorney leaned back in her chair. Most custody battles turn ugly, she said. I'm not interested in ugly, Mirabel replied calmly. I'm interested in protecting my kids. That clarity shaped every decision Mirabel made moving forward. She never badmouthed Donald in front of the children. When he came to pick them up for visitation, she remained polite, even when the tension between them was obvious. One evening, Donald stood awkwardly near the front door while their son searched for his sneakers. "You don't have to act like everything's normal," Donald said quietly. Mirabel looked at him. "I'm not acting." Donald frowned slightly. "You're not angry at me?" She paused before answering. "I'm disappointed." The word landed harder than shouting would have. Donald looked away. Their daughter ran toward him with a stuffed animal in her hands. "Daddy." Donald knelt down and scooped her up. For a moment, the room looked almost like it used to. Family, routine, normal life. But both adults understood that the structure holding those moments together had already cracked. Later that night, Mirabel sat at the kitchen table reviewing documents her attorney had sent over, school reports, financial statements, schedules. Her phone buzzed. A message from her lawyer. Court date confirmed. Mirabel stared at the screen for a moment. Then she set the phone down slowly. In another part of the city, Donald Walker was feeling something very different. Confidence. He believed the custody hearing would confirm everything he already assumed. That money and success proved stability. That the judge would see his life as more secure. That Mirabel would eventually have to accept the outcome. But Donald had misunderstood something fundamental about Mirabel Johnson. Her strength had never been loud. It had never required attention. It lived in quiet patience, careful thinking, and the willingness to stand firm when things mattered most. As the court date approached, Mirabel continued her routine exactly the same way. Morning breakfasts, school drop-offs, long work days at the billing office, bedtime stories. But beneath that ordinary rhythm, something important was taking shape. Preparation. Because when the day finally arrived for both of them to stand inside that Jacksonville courtroom, Donald Walker would walk in believing he had already won, and Mirabel Johnson would walk in knowing the truth had finally caught up to him. The morning of the custody hearing arrived with a kind of quiet tension that sits in the air before something important happens. Jacksonville's courthouse stood tall against the early sunlight, its wide stone steps already filling with people moving in and out of the building, lawyers carrying briefcases, families speaking in hushed voices, security officers directing people through the metal detectors. Donald Walker stepped out of his car and adjusted the cuff of his shirt before closing the door. His suit was perfectly pressed, navy blue, the same one he wore when meeting investors or negotiating major contracts. He paused for a moment in the parking lot and looked up at the courthouse. Then he exhaled slowly. This was just another challenge, another situation that required confidence and preparation. He had both. Inside the building, the air conditioning hummed softly as people shuffled through security. Donald's lawyer stood near the elevators reviewing a folder when Donald approached. "You ready?" the lawyer asked. Donald nodded. "As I'll ever be." The lawyer handed him a few documents. "These are the key points we'll emphasize today." Donald scanned the page briefly. Financial stability, housing security, structured environment. He nodded again. "That's all accurate." The lawyer leaned slightly closer. "The most important thing is that you stay calm during testimony." Donald smiled faintly. "I run construction crews for a living. Staying calm is the job." They stepped into the elevator, along with several other people heading to different courtrooms. When the doors opened, the hallway outside the courtroom buzzed with quiet conversation. Donald spotted Mirabel immediately. She sat on a wooden bench beside her attorney, hands folded neatly in her lap. Her posture was straight, her expression calm. She wore a simple dark dress and had her hair pulled back neatly. Donald studied her for a moment. She looked exactly like she always had, composed, grounded, but something about the situation made him avoid eye contact. Not because he was afraid, at least that's what he told himself, mostly because he didn't want unnecessary tension before the hearing started. His lawyer glanced toward her. "That's your wife." "Ex-wife," Donald corrected quietly. "Not officially yet," the lawyer replied. Donald didn't respond. Instead, he focused on the courtroom doors. The bailiff stepped into the hallway. "The Walker custody case will begin shortly." People began filing inside. Donald followed his lawyer to their table near the front. Across the room, Mirabel and her attorney took their seats at the opposite table. The courtroom itself felt quiet but heavy. Tall windows let in thin strips of morning light. The American flag stood beside the judge's bench. Several observers sat quietly in the back rows. Donald adjusted his jacket and leaned slightly toward his lawyer. "This won't take long," he whispered. His lawyer nodded. "That depends on how prepared the other side is." Donald glanced briefly toward Mirabel again. She wasn't looking at him. Instead, she sat quietly reviewing something with her attorney. He felt a strange mix of emotions in that moment: confidence, impatience, and somewhere underneath it all, a faint trace of irritation, because in Donald's mind, the outcome felt obvious. He had resources, he had stability, he had a successful business. What could Mirabel possibly say that would outweigh that? The courtroom doors closed. The bailiff stepped forward. "All rise." Everyone stood as the judge entered the room and took his seat. "Be seated." The judge reviewed a few documents before looking up. "Today we are hearing the custody case regarding the Walker children." Donald felt his lawyer's hand lightly tap the table. A quiet signal. "Stay focused." The proceedings began. Donald's lawyer stood first, addressing the judge with confident professionalism. "Your Honor, my client Donald Walker is a successful business owner who has consistently demonstrated his ability to provide financial stability and a structured environment for his children." Donald sat tall in his chair while the lawyer continued outlining his life, his home, his income, his involvement with the children. From a distance, the argument sounded strong, solid. Donald glanced briefly toward Mirabel again. She remained completely still. No reactions, no visible emotion, just quiet attention. If Donald noticed anything unusual in that moment, it was the calmness in her posture. Not defensive, not worried, just patient. But Donald brushed the thought aside, because in his mind, the facts still favored him. And by the time the judge asked him to take the witness stand, Donald Walker walked forward believing the outcome of the day was already written. Donald Walker sat in the witness chair with his shoulders straight and his hands resting calmly on the wooden armrests. The courtroom felt quieter from that seat, more focused. Every person in the room seemed to be watching, but Donald had spoken in front of investors, city officials, and large project teams before. Being the center of attention wasn't new to him. His lawyer stood beside him and began asking the prepared questions. "Mr. Walker, could you tell the court about your profession?" Donald answered clearly. "I own and operate a construction company here in Jacksonville." "And how long have you been running this company?" "About 8 years." "Would you describe the business as successful?" Donald nodded. "Yes." The lawyer continued guiding him through the narrative they had prepared. Donald spoke about the company's growth, about his income, about the home he had recently purchased after separating from Mirabel. "A stable environment is extremely important for children," his lawyer said. "Would you agree with that?" "Absolutely," Donald replied. "And do you believe you can provide that?" "I do." The lawyer paced slowly in front of the witness stand. "Mr. Walker, are you actively involved in your children's lives?" Donald leaned forward slightly. "Yes." "Could you explain how?" "I attend school events when possible," Donald said. "I spend time with them during my visitation schedule. I make sure they're taken care of." His lawyer nodded approvingly. "Would it be fair to say your goal is to provide them with the best possible future?" "Yes." The lawyer turned toward the judge. "No further questions at this time." Donald stepped down from the witness stand, feeling steady. Everything had gone exactly as planned. He returned to his seat beside his attorney. Across the room, Mirabel remained quiet. Her lawyer stood slowly. "Your Honor, the respondent would like to ask a few questions." The judge nodded. "Proceed." Mirabel's attorney approached the witness stand and adjusted a stack of papers. "Mr. Walker," she began calmly, "you mentioned that stability is important for children." Donald nodded. "Yes, and you believe your current life situation provides that stability." "I do." The attorney walked a few steps closer. "Mr. Walker, are you currently in a relationship with another woman?" Donald didn't hesitate. "Yes." "And this relationship began before your separation from Mirabel Johnson?" Donald paused briefly. Then he answered, "Yes." A quiet murmur moved through the courtroom. The attorney continued, "And this woman is currently pregnant, correct?" Donald nodded again. "Yes." "Are you the father of that child?" Donald sat up slightly straighter. "Yes." His answer came quickly, almost proudly. He glanced briefly toward Mirabel, as if expecting some kind of reaction, but she remained still. The attorney paused for a moment. Then she asked another question. Mr. Walker, when did you first learn about the pregnancy? Several months ago. And you believe the child belongs to you? Yes. The attorney nodded slowly. Then she turned slightly toward the judge. Your Honor, we would like to introduce new information into the record. Donald's lawyer frowned. What information? The attorney held up a document. A paternity test. Donald blinked. What? The attorney placed the papers on the evidence table. This document was submitted by another individual who had a relationship with the same woman Mr. Walker is referring to. Donald felt a small knot tighten in his stomach. His lawyer leaned forward. Objection, he said quickly. We have not reviewed this document. The judge raised a hand. Let's hear the explanation. Mirabel's attorney nodded. The test was taken by a man who had been in a relationship with the woman in question before Mr. Walker became involved with her. Donald stared at the papers, now being passed toward the judge. Confusion crept into his voice. What does that have to do with anything? The attorney turned toward him. It has everything to do with the claim that this pregnancy demonstrates stability in Mr. Walker's current household. Donald's lawyer stood again. Your Honor, this line of questioning. But before he could finish, something unexpected happened. Mirabel spoke. It was the first time she had said anything during the hearing. Her voice was calm, not loud, but it carried clearly through the room. Donald. Donald turned toward her automatically. For the first time that morning, their eyes met. Her expression wasn't angry. It wasn't triumphant. If anything, it looked almost sad. Are you absolutely sure that baby she's carrying is yours? The question echoed in the silent courtroom. Donald frowned. What kind of question is that? Mirabel's lawyer slid another sheet of paper toward the judge. The judge read it slowly. Then he looked up. Mr. Walker, according to this document, the paternity test shows a 99% probability that another man is the father. Donald felt the air leave his chest. What? His lawyer grabbed the document quickly, scanning the results. Donald stood halfway from his chair. That's not possible. The courtroom had gone completely silent. Every person watching seemed frozen. Donald looked toward Mirabel again. You knew about this? She didn't smile. She didn't look satisfied. She simply nodded once. Yes. Donald's voice cracked with disbelief. Why didn't you say something? Mirabel's answer came quietly. Because you were so sure you had everything figured out. The judge leaned forward slightly. Mr. Walker, it appears the situation you described regarding your household may not be accurate. Donald looked down at the document in his lawyer's hand. The numbers were clear. There was no misunderstanding, no mistake. The baby he believed represented his new beginning, was never his child at all, and in that moment, inside a silent Jacksonville courtroom, Donald Walker realized the foundation he thought he had built his future on didn't exist. For a few seconds after the judge finished speaking, Donald Walker couldn't hear anything. The courtroom was still. People were watching, but the sound in his ears felt distant, like someone had closed a door between him and the rest of the room. That's not possible, Donald repeated quietly. His lawyer leaned closer, whispering urgently, Donald, sit down. But Donald barely heard him. He kept staring at the document in his lawyer's hand. A paternity test. Black ink. Clear numbers. 99% probability. Another man. The judge cleared his throat gently. Mr. Walker, please take your seat. Donald slowly lowered himself into the chair. Across the room, Mirabel remained exactly where she had been the entire morning. Calm, still. Her attorney spoke again, addressing the court. Your Honor, the purpose of presenting this information is not to embarrass Mr. Walker. The attorney's voice was steady, but Mr. Walker's argument for primary custody relies heavily on the claim that he is establishing a new stable household environment. She gestured lightly toward the document. This evidence raises serious concerns about that claim. Donald's lawyer quickly stood up. Your Honor, my client had no knowledge of this situation. That may be true, the judge replied, but it does impact the court's understanding of the circumstances. Donald's hands rested on the table now, but they were no longer steady. He leaned toward his lawyer. You didn't know about this? He whispered. The lawyer shook his head slowly. No. Donald felt heat rise in his chest. Not just embarrassment, something worse. Realization. He thought back to the night she told him she was pregnant. The relief in her face. The way she held on to him. The way he had convinced himself everything was falling perfectly into place. His mind replayed those moments differently now. Questions he should have asked. Doubts he ignored. Details he overlooked. The judge continued reviewing the documents in front of him. "Mr. Walker," he said calmly, "this court must evaluate the overall stability and environment in which these children will be raised." Donald swallowed hard. "Yes, Your Honor. Your testimony earlier suggested that your new household situation demonstrated stability." Donald opened his mouth to respond, but for the first time that morning, he didn't know what to say, because the story he had been presenting just minutes earlier had collapsed in front of everyone. The judge folded the document and placed it back on the table. "This information raises serious questions about the judgments surrounding your recent life decisions." Donald lowered his eyes. Across the room, Mirabel watched quietly, not with satisfaction, not with anger, just quiet clarity. Donald finally looked up again, and in that moment, he saw something in Mirabel's face that unsettled him more than the courtroom embarrassment. Disappointment. Not the loud kind, the deep kind, the kind that appears when someone stops expecting better from you. His lawyer attempted to regain control of the situation. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "Mr. Walker's financial stability and ability to provide for the children remains unchanged." "That may be true," the judge replied, "but stability is not measured by finances alone." The courtroom remained silent. The judge leaned back slightly in his chair. "The court must consider emotional stability, living arrangements, and the judgment demonstrated by both parents." Donald felt the weight of every eye in the room again. Observers in the back rows whispered quietly. The bailiff glanced toward them, restoring order. But the damage had already been done. Donald's carefully constructed confidence had evaporated. Moments earlier, he had walked into the courtroom believing he controlled the narrative. Now the entire story had shifted. And for the first time since the divorce began, Donald realized something that hadn't occurred to him before. He had completely underestimated Mirabel, because while he had been building arguments based on money and status, Mirabel had been quietly preparing the truth. The judge glanced between both tables. "I will review the evidence presented today and deliver a ruling after further consideration." He looked directly at Donald. "In the meantime, I strongly encourage both parties to reflect on the decisions that brought them here." The gavel tapped lightly against the bench. "Court is adjourned." People began standing slowly. Papers shuffled. Chairs moved. But Donald remained seated for a moment longer. His lawyer leaned down beside him. "We'll talk outside." Donald nodded faintly. Across the room, Mirabel stood beside her attorney. For a moment, the two of them simply looked at each other across the space that had once been their shared life. No shouting, no accusations, just the quiet understanding that something permanent had been revealed. And as Donald finally stood up and walked toward the courthouse hallway, the confidence he carried into that courtroom that morning was gone. In its place was a realization far heavier than any legal ruling. He hadn't just lost control of the custody case. He had lost control of the story he believed his life was telling. The weeks after the hearing moved slowly, not in the way busy weeks normally pass. These felt stretched, heavy. Every day seemed to carry the quiet awareness that something important was still unresolved. For Mirabel, life stayed mostly the same on the surface. The kid still woke up early. Her son still asked questions before the sun finished rising. "Mama, do fish sleep?" Her daughter still refused to eat anything green, unless it was hidden under something else. Mornings still meant packing lunches, tying tiny sneakers, and rushing out the door to make it to school drop-offs before heading downtown to the medical billing office. But underneath the routine, Mirabel carried the knowledge that a decision about her children's future was sitting somewhere on a judge's desk. Donald experienced those weeks very differently. For the first time in years, the confidence that had always fueled him felt unstable. He still went to job sites, still held meetings, still signed contracts, but every quiet moment left space for his mind to wander back to the courtroom, back to that moment when the document slid across the table, back to the look on Mirabel's face when she asked him that question. "Are you absolutely sure that baby she's carrying is yours?" The relationship he thought represented his new beginning had collapsed almost immediately after that hearing. When Donald confronted the woman about the paternity test, the conversation ended faster than he expected. She didn't fight the evidence. She didn't deny it. She simply packed a bag and left his apartment that same evening. No long explanations, no apologies. Just gone. Donald stood alone in the quiet apartment afterward, staring at the door she had closed behind her. For the first time since the affair began, the reality of what he had destroyed became impossible to ignore. A few weeks later, both Donald and Mirabel received the same phone call. The court had scheduled the final ruling. The morning of the decision felt different from the hearing. Less tense, more final. Donald walked into the courthouse wearing the same navy suit he had worn before, but this time, the confidence that once filled his steps was gone. Across the hallway, Mirabel stood beside her attorney again. She greeted Donald with a small nod. Nothing more. The courtroom felt quieter than the previous hearing. Fewer observers, less movement. When the judge entered, everyone stood. All rise. Moments later, everyone sat again. The judge reviewed the documents in front of him before speaking. I have reviewed the testimony and evidence presented during the custody hearing involving the Walker children. Donald felt his hands tighten slightly in his lap. Beside him, his lawyer remained silent. Across the room, Mirabel sat still. The judge continued. Both parents clearly care about the well-being of their children. He paused briefly before continuing. However, the court must determine which environment offers the most consistent stability. Donald already knew what was coming. He could feel it in the tone of the judge's voice. Based on the evidence presented, the court finds that Mirabel Johnson has demonstrated a consistent primary caregiving role and a stable home environment for the children. The judge looked up. Primary custody will be awarded to Mirabel Johnson. Donald lowered his eyes. The words landed quietly, not dramatically, just final. The judge continued. Donald Walker will be granted scheduled visitation and parental rights consistent with maintaining a healthy relationship between the children and their father. Donald nodded faintly. He wasn't surprised, not anymore, because somewhere between the hearing and this moment, he had already understood how the decision would likely end. But hearing it spoken aloud still carried weight. The judge closed the folder. I encourage both parents to cooperate in providing a stable and supportive environment for the children moving forward. The gavel tapped lightly. Court is adjourned. The room slowly came to life again. Chairs moved. Papers gathered. People stood. But Donald remained seated for a few seconds longer. He had walked into that courtroom weeks earlier believing he would win. Now he understood something much more painful. Winning had never really been the point, because the thing he had truly lost couldn't be decided by a judge. Outside the courthouse, the Florida air felt warm and heavy. Cars moved slowly through downtown traffic. People walked past the courthouse steps, carrying briefcases and coffee cups, unaware of the lives that had just shifted inside the building behind them. Mirabel stood near the bottom of the steps, speaking quietly with her attorney. Donald exited the courthouse a few minutes later. For a moment, he considered walking straight to his car, leaving, driving away. But something inside him told him he needed to say something first. He approached slowly. Mirabel. She turned when she heard her name. Her attorney glanced between them before speaking. I'll give you two a moment. The attorney walked a few steps away. Donald stood in front of Mirabel. For the first time in a long time, he looked unsure of himself. I guess this is it, he said quietly. Mirabel nodded once. The kids will be with me during the week, she said calmly. You'll have them on your scheduled weekends. Donald nodded. I understand. A few seconds passed between them. Then Donald spoke again. I'm sorry. Mirabel didn't respond immediately, not because she didn't hear him, because she was deciding how much that word meant now. Donald continued. I know I messed things up. Mirabel watched him carefully. You did. Donald looked down at the concrete steps. I thought I knew what I was doing. You did, Mirabel replied. He looked up. What do you mean? You knew exactly what you were doing every time you made those choices. Donald swallowed. Mirabel, I made a mistake. She studied him for a long moment. Then she shook her head slowly. No. Donald frowned slightly. No, you didn't make one mistake, she said quietly. You made 100 small choices that led you here. The words settled between them. Donald felt his chest tighten. Mirabel. Is there any chance? He hesitated before finishing the sentence. Any chance we could fix this? For the first time during the conversation, something softer appeared in Mirabel's eyes. Not anger, not resentment, just clarity. Some things you can rebuild, she said gently. Donald held his breath, but trust isn't one of them. Donald looked down again, because deep down, he already knew that. Mirabel glanced toward the street, where her mother waited with the children in the car. I need to go, she said softly. Donald nodded. She turned and walked down the sidewalk without looking back. Donald stood there watching until she disappeared around the corner. Life didn't stop after that day. It rarely does. Years passed, the way years always do. Quietly, Mirabel focused on raising the children with the same steady patience she had always carried. Their son grew taller every year. His endless questions slowly turned into opinions about sports, school, and music. Their daughter developed the same quiet determination Mirabel had shown as a child. Strong-willed, observant. Their home remained full of the same things that had always mattered to Mirabel. Laughter, routine, peace. It wasn't perfect. No home ever is, but it was stable. Donald remained part of the children's lives. He showed up for school events, weekend visits, birthday parties. He loved them deeply. But every time he watched them run toward Mirabel after a soccer game or a school recital, he felt the quiet weight of something he couldn't undo. He hadn't lost his family in a single moment. He had lost it slowly, through small decisions, small lies, small moments where he chose ego over honesty. And that realization stayed with him longer than any court ruling ever could. Years later, during one of their son's school events, Donald stood near the back of the auditorium watching the stage. Mirabel stood a few rows ahead with the other parents. She laughed quietly at something one of the teachers said. For a moment, Donald felt something close to gratitude, not for the way things ended, but for the lesson they had left behind. Because the truth about relationships is rarely dramatic. They don't collapse because of one terrible moment. They collapse through small choices people convince themselves don't matter, until one day they realize those choices added up to something permanent. And by then, the life they thought would always be there is already gone. There's something people rarely admit about stories like this. Most folks expect the ending to feel like justice, like someone wins and someone loses. But real life almost never works that way. Years after the courtroom, the pieces of Mirabel and Donald's lives continued moving forward in ways neither of them had predicted. One Saturday afternoon, their son had a basketball game at the middle school gym on Jacksonville's north side. The bleachers were half full of parents and relatives yelling encouragement from the sidelines. Mirabel sat with a few other mothers near the front, her daughter beside her with a bag of popcorn balanced on her knees. Go! Go! Their daughter shouted as her brother chased the ball down the court. Donald stood along the wall near the back of the gym. That had become his quiet habit over the years. He still came to almost every event, but he rarely sat beside Mirabel anymore. Not because she had asked him to stay away, because he understood something had changed in the space between them, and he respected it. When the game ended, their son jogged toward the bleachers, sweaty and smiling. "Did you see that shot?" he asked excitedly. Mirabel laughed. "Yes, baby, I saw it." Donald walked over too. "That was a good move," he said, giving the boy a quick high five. Their daughter tugged Donald's sleeve. "Daddy, you coming to the ice cream place?" Donald looked toward Mirabel. She nodded. "That's fine." So the four of them walked across the parking lot together. Not like the old days, not like a married couple raising small children, but something quieter. Two parents who had learned how to exist on the same path again for the sake of the people who mattered most. Inside the ice cream shop, the kids argued about flavors, while Mirabel stood near the counter. Donald waited beside her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Donald said something quietly. "You did a good job with them." Mirabel glanced at him. "They're good kids." "I know." He hesitated. Then he added something he had never fully said before. "I should have listened to you more." Mirabel looked at him thoughtfully. Years earlier, those words might have meant something different. Now they simply felt like honesty arriving late. But honesty all the same. "We were both learning," she said. Donald nodded slowly. Their son ran over, holding a giant ice cream cone. "Mama, look." Mirabel laughed. "That thing, bigger than your head." Their daughter skipped behind him, holding a cup with rainbow sprinkles. The moment filled with laughter again. Simple, ordinary, human. Donald watched the scene quietly, and somewhere in that moment, he understood something that had taken him years to accept. Losing Mirabel had never been about the courtroom, or the custody ruling, or even the other woman. It had been about the slow accumulation of choices he convinced himself didn't matter, choices that slowly eroded the trust of the person who had stood beside him when his life was still being built. And once that trust was gone, no amount of success could bring it back. Mirabel stepped outside the shop with the kids while Donald followed a few steps behind. The evening air felt warm, and the Florida sky glowed orange as the sun began to set. Their daughter grabbed Mirabel's hand. Their son walked ahead, telling an excited story about the basketball game. Donald paused near the door for a moment before stepping outside, watching them, listening to the laughter, and realizing something that many people only understand too late. Love rarely disappears because of one big mistake. It disappears through the small decisions we make when we think no one is paying attention. The moments we ignore, the honesty we avoid, the people we assume will always be there no matter what we do. But the truth is, the grass isn't greener somewhere else. It's greener where you water it. Mirabel learned that lesson early. Donald learned it later. And the children they both loved grew up in a home built on something far stronger than promises: respect. Before you go, I want to hear from you. Have you ever seen a relationship fall apart, not because of one big moment, but because of a lot of small choices people ignored? If this story made you think about something in your own life, share your thoughts in the comments. I read them, and a lot of people here learn from each other's experiences. And if you believe stories like this help people see life a little clearer, make sure you like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story.
Thank you for watching Mr. Graham Stories, my beautiful, amazing family.